The 1950s American mother had everything her own mother had been denied: a house in the suburbs, a car in the driveway, a husband who came home for dinner, modern appliances that promised to make her life effortless, a stable income, and children who wore clean clothes to school. She lived inside a picture-perfect postcard that the entire country had agreed was the dream. And by every internal measure that survives in diaries, in letters never sent, in doctor's notes, and in the quiet confessions whispered over afternoon cocktails, she was the most depressed, the most medicated, and the most quietly desperate cohort of American women in the 20th century. That postcard was built on a promise sold to an entire generation after the chaos of the Great Depression and the horror of World War II. The highest calling for an American woman was to create a calm, clean, well-ordered home. She had done her patriotic duty in the factories while the men fought overseas, but now the men were back. The baby boom was underway, and everywhere the message was the same: fulfillment comes from waxed floors, well-fed children, and a smile that never falters. And for a brief moment, the whole country seemed to believe it. But inside the houses with the manicured lawns and the matching curtains, something else was brewing. Doctors began noticing a strange pattern in their waiting rooms. Young mothers, with no diagnosable physical illness, reporting chronic exhaustion, unexplained weeping, a fog of sadness that settled in after the morning dishes were done. By the late 1950s, the medical profession had a name for it: housewife syndrome. The solution, far too often, was a prescription. Valium and Librium, marketed as mother's little helpers, were dispensed like vitamins, turning American women into the most medicated demographic on Earth. By the mid-60s, women were being prescribed tranquilizers at double the rate of men. What the pills couldn't fix, the afternoon cocktail ritual tried to numb. Gin and tonics poured at 4 p.m. were not a celebration. They were a quiet pact between neighbors who recognized the same hollow ache but had no vocabulary to name it. That ache is the subject of this story, but the story doesn't end with the silence. It ends with the moment the silence broke: a best-selling book, a poet's suicide that revealed the crisis from the inside, and a generation of daughters who looked at their mothers' lives and resolved to live differently. Before that break, though, before the feminist movement and the divorce rate shockwave of 1969, the evidence of the catastrophe was already there, hiding in the most ordinary places. And that is precisely where we begin. Not in the offices of psychiatrists or the halls of Congress, but in the diary of a young mother in 1957, staring at the luncheon plates she had just washed and wondering why she felt like crying. Her name was Eleanor. She was 27 years old, married to a decent man who worked at an insurance firm, mother to 2 small boys, and she lived in a split-level house on a tree-lined street in Levittown, Pennsylvania. On the morning of October 15, 1957, after her husband left for work and the children were at school, she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee and wrote in her diary, "I have everything I ever wanted. Why does it feel like nothing?" She stared at the words for a long time, then closed the book and began scrubbing the breakfast dishes until her hands turned raw. Eleanor was not alone. In thousands of identical kitchens across America, women were asking themselves the same question and getting no answer. They had been promised that marriage and motherhood were the summit of female fulfillment, that a new refrigerator and wall-to-wall carpeting would bring contentment as surely as the sun rose in the east. And yet, by the mid-1950s, doctors were noticing a strange epidemic sweeping through their waiting rooms. Young mothers, physically healthy by every clinical measure, were showing up with the same set of symptoms: chronic fatigue that sleep could not fix, headaches that no aspirin could touch, spells of weeping that arrived without warning and refused to leave. The patients could not explain it. The doctors could not diagnose it. So the medical profession did what it often does when confronted with something it cannot understand. It gave the condition a name and a pill. They called it housewife syndrome. The term entered medical journals in the late 1950s, a label that managed to sound both clinical and dismissive at the same time. Physicians described women who appeared well-groomed and composed on the surface, but who confessed, when pressed, to feelings of emptiness, worthlessness, and a restless agitation they could not shake. The recommended treatment was rarely therapy. Talk was time-consuming and expensive, and, besides, what would they talk about? The monotony of laundry. Instead, doctors reached for their prescription pads. The drug of choice was meprobamate, sold under the brand name Miltown, a mild tranquilizer that had exploded onto the market in 1955 and quickly became the fastest-selling drug in American history. By 1956, 1 in every 3 prescriptions written in the United States was for Miltown, and women were the primary consumers. But Miltown was only the opening act. In 1960, the pharmaceutical company Roche introduced a new compound called diazepam, better known as Valium. It was stronger, faster acting, and marketed with a cheerful confidence that bordered on utopian. Advertisements showed a woman clutching a bottle of pills, her face serene, with a headline that read, "For the unhappily married, the overworked mother, the woman who cannot cope." Valium prescriptions doubled, then tripled, then became so commonplace that the Rolling Stones would eventually memorialize the phenomenon in a song that called them Mother's Little Helpers. By the mid-1960s, American women were being prescribed tranquilizers and sedatives at a rate more than double that of men. In some suburban counties, the number was closer to triple. The pills did not cure anything. They smoothed the edges, muffled the despair, and kept the machinery of domestic life running smoothly enough that nobody had to ask any uncomfortable questions. And yet, if you wanted to understand what these women were running from, you had to look at the world they were told to want. The story of the 1950s housewife begins, paradoxically, with a war. During World War II, millions of American women had entered the workforce for the first time, building bombers, welding ships, managing supply lines. They earned their own money, discovered their own competence, and tasted a kind of independence that their mothers had never imagined. When the war ended and the soldiers came home, the cultural machinery of the nation swung into reverse with astonishing speed and precision. Women were fired en masse from their factory jobs to make room for returning veterans. Government propaganda, women's magazines, Hollywood films, and the booming new medium of television all began broadcasting a single, unified message: your real job is at home. Your real fulfillment is in your husband, your children, and your kitchen. The highest calling of the American woman is to create a sanctuary of domestic bliss. And the American woman listened. She enrolled in home economics courses that taught her how to fold napkins and arrange flower centers. She purchased vacuum cleaners and electric mixers and automatic washing machines that manufacturers promised would transform housework from drudgery into a form of leisure. She moved with her husband into the newly constructed suburbs that spread like a fungal bloom across the American landscape, rows of identical houses with identical floor plans and identical expectations. The average age of first marriage for women dropped to 20 years old, the lowest it had been since the 1890s. The birth rate soared, creating the demographic bulge known as the baby boom. By 1955, the United States had the highest marriage rate in the developed world. If you were a woman and you were not married by 25, something was considered to be deeply wrong with you. The pressure was not just external. It was woven into the very fabric of daily life. Women's magazines like Ladies' Home Journal, McCall's, and Good Housekeeping served as the instruction manuals for this new domestic religion. Every issue featured articles with titles like Femininity Begins at Home or How to Snare a Husband, alongside recipes, cleaning tips, and fashion spreads that emphasized soft, unthreatening silhouettes. The fiction published in these magazines told stories of spirited young women who resisted domesticity only to learn by the final paragraph that true happiness lay in surrendering to a good man and a steady home. Advertisements reinforced the message with a relentlessness that bordered on psychological warfare. A woman's value was measured by the whiteness of her laundry, the shininess of her floors, the delighted smile on her husband's face when he tasted the pot roast. If she failed at any of these, the advertisements implied she was failing at womanhood itself. This ideology was so pervasive, so total, that the writer Betty Friedan would later give it a name, the feminine mystique, and she would describe it as a trap. The feminine mystique held that women could find complete fulfillment through housework, marriage, sexual passivity, and child-rearing alone. It insisted that a truly feminine woman had no desire for higher education, a career, or a political voice. To want those things was to be unnatural, neurotic, and deeply unfeminine. The mystique did not need to be enforced by law, because it was enforced by something far more powerful: the relentless, smiling, pastel-colored consensus that this was simply the way things were. But here is what the magazines did not print. Behind the curtains of those perfect suburban homes, something corrosive was eating away at the women who inhabited them. The evidence was everywhere, if you knew where to look. In 1957, a sweeping mental health survey assessed thousands of Americans and found that housewives reported higher rates of psychological distress than any other group, including single working women and married working men. A staggering 1 in 4 suburban housewives told researchers that they experienced frequent spells of unexplained crying. The research also revealed that married women were 3 times more likely than married men to describe themselves as unhappy, passive, and having nightmares and phobias. Housewives were found to suffer from higher levels of anxiety, depression, and what the survey politely termed emotional instability than women who held jobs outside the home. The diary entries, letters, and private confessions from this era paint a picture far darker than any official report could capture. A mother of 4 from Ohio wrote to a women's magazine in 1956, "I am surrounded by people I love, and yet I have never felt so lonely in my entire life." A young wife in California confessed to her journal, "Sometimes I stand in the middle of the living room and scream into a pillow just to hear something that sounds real." A woman in New York described the sensation of waking up each morning with the certainty that a heavy weight was pressing on her chest, a weight that had no name and no origin and no reason to exist, because by every objective measure her life was perfect. And so she did what millions of women did. She poured a drink at 4 in the afternoon, popped a pill her doctor had prescribed, and told herself she was lucky. The afternoon cocktail ritual became an unspoken institution of suburban life. Gin and tonics, whiskey sours, vodka concealed in orange juice. The drinks were not celebratory. They were medicinal. They took the edge off the long stretch of hours between the children's bedtime and the husband's return from work. They made it possible to smile through dinner. They blurred the contours of a question that was too terrifying to ask directly. Is this all there is? The drinking was often solitary, or shared with a neighbor who recognized the same hollow ache and would never dream of mentioning it. A silent pact formed across fence rows and grocery store aisles. We do not talk about it. We do not admit it. We pour another round and carry on. Psychiatrists, for their part, were largely unequipped to help. The field was dominated by Freudian psychoanalysis, which held that a woman's discontent was a sign of pathological maladjustment to her natural role. If a housewife was unhappy, the reasoning went, it must be because she had failed to properly accept her femininity, because she harbored unconscious resentment of her husband, or because she was suffering from a form of hysteria that could be traced back to unresolved childhood conflicts. The cure was rarely liberation. The cure was adjustment. Learn to want what you already have. Take your pills. Be a better wife. The voices that dissented from this consensus were few, isolated, and easily dismissed. One of those voices belonged to a young poet named Sylvia Plath, who was writing in her journals during these same years with a ferocity that would only be fully understood after her death. In the summer of 1953, at the age of 20, Plath attempted suicide for the first time. She crawled under the front porch of her mother's house and swallowed a bottle of sleeping pills. She survived, barely, and was subjected to electroshock therapy that she would later describe as the most brutal experience of her life. Her journals from this period are filled with insights that read like a diagnosis of the entire era. "I am afraid of getting married," she wrote. "It is like a death." And yet, she did marry, and she did try to be the perfect wife and mother and poet all at once, and the attempt would break her. But that is a later chapter. For now, the important thing to understand is that the silence was not total. Beneath the surface of the 1950s, a countercurrent was beginning to stir. In kitchens and coffee clutches, in letters to the editor and confessions whispered to friends, women were starting to compare notes. They were discovering that the fog of despair they thought was a private failing was actually a shared condition. The first cracks in the feminine mystique were hairline fractures, barely visible, but once they appeared, they would prove impossible to seal. And then, in 1957, a former magazine writer and suburban housewife named Betty Friedan was asked to conduct a survey of her Smith College classmates for their 15th reunion. She expected a simple exercise in nostalgia. What she received instead was a flood of letters so raw, so full of an unnamed and unnameable grief, that she realized she was holding evidence of a catastrophe hiding in plain sight. Women with degrees from one of the finest colleges in the country were describing lives of quiet desperation, of talents wasted and ambitions crushed, and a longing they could not articulate. Friedan spent the next 6 years interviewing more women, gathering data, and piecing together the architecture of the trap. By the time she sat down to write, she had a thesis and a title. The Feminine Mystique would become one of the most explosive books of the 20th century. But in 1957, it was still just a pile of anguished letters on a kitchen table in Rockland County, New York, and the woman who would change history had not yet typed a single word. When Betty Friedan opened the first envelope from her Smith College classmates in 1957, she expected nostalgia. She had been a star student, a psychology major who had edited the college newspaper and seemed destined for a career in journalism. But like so many of her generation, she had stepped away from that path after marriage and motherhood, trading deadlines for diapers, bylines for grocery lists. When the reunion survey asked her classmates to reflect on their lives, Friedan assumed the responses would be a pleasant catalogue of domestic contentment. What arrived instead was a detonation. The letters were not happy. They were not even polite. They were raw, confused, and threaded with a grief that the women themselves could not fully articulate. One classmate described sitting in her beautiful living room and suddenly bursting into tears for no reason she could name. Another wrote that she had everything she had ever wanted but felt, she said, as if she were living inside a glassed box, watching the world through invisible walls. A third confessed that she drank heavily every afternoon just to make it until dinner. A fourth described recurring fantasies of simply walking out the front door and never coming back. These were educated women, privileged women, women who by every external measure were the success stories of the American dream. And they were miserable. Friedan was a trained researcher, and she realized she was staring at something far larger than a collection of personal disappointments. She was looking at the ragged edge of a social catastrophe. She began interviewing more women, not just her college peers but housewives in her own suburb, mothers at the playground, strangers in grocery stores. The stories piled up like evidence at a crime scene. She spent 6 years collecting data, reading psychological studies, analyzing advertisements, and reconstructing the architecture of a system that had convinced an entire generation of women that their only legitimate aspiration was to be wives and mothers, and then had left them stranded in a desert of unfulfilled longing when that aspiration proved insufficient. She named that system the Feminine Mystique, and when her book finally appeared in February of 1963, it would explode across the country like a bomb. But before that explosion, before the women's movement, and the marches and the consciousness-raising groups, before the divorce rate spiked and the laws changed, the catastrophe was already unfolding in the quietest possible way. And if you want to understand just how deep the rot went, you have to look at the numbers. In 1957, the same year Friedan began collecting her letters, a major mental health survey was conducted across the United States. It was one of the most ambitious attempts ever made to map the psychological landscape of the American population. Researchers interviewed thousands of adults, asking detailed questions about their emotional states, their daily habits, their private struggles. The results, when they were finally analyzed, revealed a finding so stark that it should have made headlines around the world. Housewives were the most psychologically distressed demographic in the entire country. More distressed than single working women. More distressed than married working men. More distressed than anyone else the survey measured. 1 in 4 suburban housewives told researchers that they experienced frequent spells of unexplained crying. These were not women living in poverty or facing obvious hardship. These were women in comfortable homes with employed husbands and healthy children. Yet they were reporting symptoms that today we would immediately recognize as clinical depression. They described feelings of emptiness, hopelessness, and a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure. They talked about losing interest in activities that had once brought them pleasure. They confessed to irritability and anger that they could not explain and felt deeply ashamed about. The survey also found that married women were 3 times more likely than married men to describe themselves as unhappy, passive, and suffering from nightmares and phobias. The housewife, that smiling centerpiece of the American family, was crumbling from the inside. But here was the truly devastating part. The medical establishment, the very institution that might have recognized this as a social crisis and demanded intervention, looked at the same data and arrived at a completely different conclusion. These women were not suffering from a sick system, the doctors decided. They were suffering from a sick self. The problem was not the role, it was the woman who could not adjust to it. And if she could not adjust on her own, there was always a chemical solution. The story of tranquilizers in America is the story of a country trying to medicate its way out of a problem it refused to name. It started with Miltown. When meprobamate hit the market in 1955, it was hailed as a miracle. Hollywood stars took it for stage fright, executives took it for stress, and suburban housewives took it in staggering quantities, because it made the endless loop of laundry and cooking and cleaning feel just bearable enough to continue. Within a year, Miltown was the most prescribed drug in the United States. Pharmacies could barely keep it on the shelves. The little white pills were passed around at bridge parties and coffee mornings with the casualness of chewing gum. One physician writing in a medical journal noted that many of his female patients simply could not function without their daily dose, and he did not seem to find this alarming. Then came the benzodiazepines, Librium in 1960, and then Valium in 1963. The same year, Friedan's book was published. Valium was stronger, faster, and backed by a marketing campaign that specifically targeted housewives. The advertisements, which ran in medical journals and popular magazines alike, showed women in states of serene, slightly vacant contentment. One famous ad featured a woman with a wedding ring and a faraway smile, the caption reading, "For the housewife who is nervous, tense, and unable to cope with the demands of her family." The message was unmistakable. If domestic life was grinding you down, the problem was not domestic life. The problem was you. And Roche had the solution in a little yellow pill. The prescribing data from this era is breathtaking. By the late 1960s, Valium was the single most prescribed drug in the Western world. Women received more than 2/3 of all prescriptions for tranquilizers and sedatives. In some states, women were being prescribed these drugs at nearly 3 times the rate of men. The pills did not cure depression. They merely blunted it, wrapped it in gauze, and sent it back into the kitchen to finish the dinner. And because the pills were prescribed by doctors and endorsed by the American Medical Association, No one thought to question whether there might be a deeper sickness beneath the surface symptoms. The silence was chemically enforced, but the silence was not perfect. If you listen carefully, you can hear the voices from the archives, the letters that women wrote to magazine advice columns, written in careful cursive on monogrammed stationery, describing a despair they could not name. The editor of Ladies' Home Journal once confided to a colleague that the volume of letters from miserable housewives was so high that she had to stop reading them, because they made her question her own life, and that was a door she could not afford to open. A writer for McCall's received a letter from a woman in Nebraska who wrote, "I have a good husband, 3 healthy children, a lovely home, but I find myself crying for no reason. Am I losing my mind?" The reply, published in the magazine, suggested a new hobby, perhaps flower arranging or volunteer work at the church. Nobody ever suggested that the grief might be reasonable, because to do so would have been to admit that the entire edifice of post-war domesticity was built on a lie. Meanwhile, in a small flat in London, the poet Sylvia Plath was writing the interior weather of this same catastrophe with a precision that would only be fully appreciated after her death. Plath was a child of the American suburbs, raised by a widowed mother who had sacrificed everything for her children and expected, in return, that her daughter would achieve the greatness she herself had been denied. Plath was brilliant, ambitious, and ferociously talented, a scholarship student at Smith College who won every prize available to her. But she was also a woman coming of age in the 1950s, and she absorbed the message of the feminine mystique as thoroughly as any of Friedan's housewives. You must be a perfect wife. You must be a perfect mother. You must keep a perfect house. And you must also write poetry that will change the world. She tried. In the summer of 1953, at the age of 20, she won a guest editorship at Mademoiselle magazine in New York City, an experience that was supposed to be the pinnacle of her young life. Instead, it broke her. The pressure to be brilliant and beautiful and effortlessly charming, all while hiding the exhaustion and the self-doubt and the gnawing fear that she was a fraud, became unbearable. She returned to her mother's house in Massachusetts and collapsed. On August 24, 1953, she crawled under the front porch, swallowed a bottle of sleeping pills, and waited to die. Her disappearance triggered a massive search. She was found 2 days later, barely alive, and hospitalized. The electroconvulsive therapy she received during her recovery left psychological scars that would never fully heal. Plath recovered, outwardly at least. She returned to Smith, graduated with highest honors, and won a Fulbright scholarship to Cambridge, where she met a young English poet named Ted Hughes. They married in 1956. She had 2 children. She baked bread, kept a spotless kitchen, and wrote poems in the stolen hours before dawn. Her journals from these years are excruciating to read because they document, with unsparing clarity, the impossible contradiction at the heart of her life. She wanted to be a domestic goddess and a literary genius simultaneously, and the world she lived in kept telling her it was possible, even though every day of her experience proved it was not. She wrote in her diary, "I must be a wife and mother and housekeeper and writer, and do each one perfectly. And if I fail at any, I fail at all." While Plath wrestled her private demons in the gray light of early morning writing sessions, millions of her American sisters were conducting their own quiet struggles in kitchens from Long Island to Los Angeles. The afternoon cocktail ritual became the unspoken sacrament of the suburban housewife. At 4 o'clock, when the children returned from school and the husband was still hours away from his train, the women in a neighborhood would drift into one another's houses or simply sit alone at their own tables and pour a drink. Gin and tonic was the most popular, though bourbon and vodka also had their adherents. The drinking was not social in the way that dinner parties are social. It was functional. It softened the edges of the afternoon. It made it possible to hear the children's demands without snapping, to greet the husband's arrival without weeping, to sit through another evening of domestic performance without screaming. and the women who participated in this ritual recognized one another without ever needing to speak about it. There was a knowledge that passed between them in glances, in the slight pause before the first sip, in the way a neighbor would accept a refill without protest. They all knew what the drinking was for. They all knew that something was wrong. But they also knew, with a certainty that had been drilled into them since childhood, that speaking the truth aloud would be a form of betrayal. Betrayal of their husbands, their children, their country, their God, the entire dream that had been promised to them as a birthright. So they drank, and they smiled, and they told themselves they were lucky. And sometimes, late at night, after the dishes were done and the children were asleep, they sat on the edge of the bathtub in the dark and wept without making a sound, because they could not explain to anyone, not even to themselves, why a life that contained everything was somehow not enough. But the silence, however carefully maintained, could not hold forever. Even before Friedan's book, the cracks were beginning to show. In the early 1960s, a handful of psychiatrists and social critics began publishing articles that questioned the official story. A psychoanalyst named Paul Chodov wrote a paper describing what he called the housewife syndrome, noting that many of his female patients presented identical symptoms that seemed to be caused not by internal pathology, but by the suffocating nature of their lives. A sociologist named Alice Rossi published an essay titled Equality Between the Sexes, arguing that the denial of meaningful work to women was a form of social violence. These voices were few and far between, and they were almost always dismissed. But they were there, and Friedan read them all. What distinguished Friedan from the other critics was her ability to synthesize. She took the letters from her Smith classmates, the data from the mental health surveys, the research on tranquilizer prescriptions, the interviews with housewives from every region of the country, the analysis of women's magazine content, the insights of the dissident psychiatrists, and she wove them into a single coherent argument. The problem that had no name, she wrote, was not a problem of individual women who had failed to adjust. It was a problem of a society that had constructed a role for women that was fundamentally incompatible with full human development. The opening sentence of her book would become one of the most famous lines in American literature. The problem lay buried, unspoken, for many years in the minds of American women. When the manuscript was complete, Friedan had difficulty finding a publisher. Several editors rejected it outright. The book, they said, was too angry, too demanding, too likely to upset the very women it claimed to represent. Finally, Will Norton agreed to publish it on the condition that Friedan remove some of the more incendiary language. She compromised. The book appeared on February 19, 1963, with a cover that looked almost like a textbook, its title stamped in plain red letters against a white background. No hint of the fire inside. The fire, as it turned out, was immediate. The Feminine Mystique sold more than 1 million copies in its first year alone. But sales figures tell only the smallest part of the story. The real impact of the book was measured in letters. Thousands of them, then tens of thousands, pouring into Friedan's publisher and her home address, written by women who felt that someone had finally, at long last, described the truth of their lives. The letters were astonishing in their consistency. Again and again, women wrote the same sentence, almost as if they were reading from a script. I thought I was the only one. A mother of 5 in Iowa wrote that she had read the book in 2 days, sobbing the entire time, and then had passed it to her sister, who had the same reaction. A housewife in Texas wrote that, after finishing the book, she sat in her car in the grocery store parking lot for an hour, unable to move, because she had never before been given permission to admit that she was unhappy. A young teacher in Massachusetts wrote that the book had saved her life, because she had been on the verge of believing that her misery was proof of her own madness, and now she understood it was proof of something else entirely. The problem that had no name now had a name, and once a thing is named, it can be fought. Across the country, In living rooms and church basements and college dormitories, women began gathering to talk about what they had read. These were not yet the consciousness-raising groups of the late 1960s, but they were their direct ancestors. The conversations started tentatively, awkwardly, with women confessing their dissatisfaction in halting terms and then looking around the room to see if they would be judged. Instead, they were met with nods, tears, and the electric shock of recognition. You too. Me too. I thought I was the only one. Yet, while Friedan's book was giving voice to millions of women, one of the most important voices of the entire era was falling silent forever. Sylvia Plath had spent the years since her suicide attempt building a life that looked, from the outside, like a triumph. She had published her first collection of poems, The Colossus, to respectful reviews. She had given birth to a daughter and a son. She had moved with her husband to a country house in Devon, where she tended a garden and wrote in the hours she could steal from domestic responsibilities. But the marriage was collapsing, and with it, the fragile structure that had held her life together. In the summer of 1962, Ted Hughes left her for another woman. Plath was alone with 2 small children, in a rented London flat during the coldest winter in a century, writing the poems that would make her immortal. That winter, in a creative burst that astounds scholars to this day, Plath wrote the poems that would be collected in the posthumous volume, Ariel. They were unlike anything she had written before, stripped of ornament, blazing with fury and grief and a fierce, almost unbearable clarity. She was writing, finally, without apology. And she was writing about the very things that Friedan had anatomized. The suffocation of domesticity, the tyranny of the perfect wife, the rage that women were not permitted to express. In a poem called The Applicant, she wrote a line that could serve as the epigraph for the entire feminine mystique. A living doll, everywhere you look. It can sew, it can cook, it can talk. But the creative breakthrough was not matched by a psychological one. Plath had been fighting depression for most of her life, and the accumulated weight of the illness, combined with the isolation of her circumstances and the relentless demands of single motherhood, pushed her past the limits of endurance. On the morning of February 11, 1963, she sealed the door to her children's room with tape and towels to protect them from the gas, then placed her head in the oven and turned on the jets. She was 30 years old. Her body was discovered by a nurse who arrived for a scheduled visit. Friedan's The Feminine Mystique was published 8 days later. The timing was not symbolic. It was simply the way the calendar worked out, a coincidence of publishing schedules and personal tragedy. But it is impossible, looking back, not to see the 2 events as a hinge. On one side, a poet who had lived inside the feminine mystique and had been destroyed by it, her voice extinguished just as she was beginning to speak the truth without compromise. On the other side, a book that would ignite a revolution, reaching millions of the very women Plath had written about, giving them the language to name their own suffering and the permission to demand something better. The question that hung in the air as 1963 unfolded was whether the book would be enough, whether the revolution it sparked would arrive in time for the women who were still silently drowning in their perfect kitchens, still pouring their afternoon gin, still swallowing their mother's little helpers, still wondering why a life that contained everything felt like nothing at all. The answer was anything but simple, and the reckoning was only just beginning. The reckoning arrived in stages, each one more disruptive than the last, and the first stage was a book that nobody in the publishing industry believed would sell. When W. Norton finally agreed to print The Feminine Mystique, the initial print run was a cautious few thousand copies. Nobody anticipated what happened next. Within weeks, the book had sold out. Within months, it had become a phenomenon that could not be contained by any category the industry understood. It was not quite self-help, not quite sociology, not quite political manifesto, and yet it was all 3 at once. The women who bought it did not merely read it, they devoured it, marked it up with underlining and exclamation marks, passed it to their neighbors, and then sat down and read it again. The book's journey through American households was almost viral in nature, decades before that word would acquire its modern meaning. A woman in a suburb of Chicago would read it, recognize herself in every chapter, and immediately mail a copy to her sister in Denver. A mother in Atlanta would leave her copy on the coffee table, and her daughter would pick it up after school and find the world rearranged. A book club in Seattle would spend an entire evening arguing about it, and then the members would go home and start arguments with their husbands that had been building for years. The content of the book was in some ways less important than the permission it granted. Friedan did not invent the dissatisfaction. She documented it, named it, and then said the thing that no one had been willing to say: "This dissatisfaction is not your fault. This misery is not a sign of your personal failure. It is a predictable response to a life that has been narrowed to the point of suffocation." For millions of women, this was not merely an intellectual insight. It was an absolution, a release from the guilt that had been eating at them for years. They wept not because the book was sad, but because it told them they were not crazy. But the book did something else, something that would prove to have even larger consequences. It connected individual suffering to structural conditions. It argued with relentless logic that the misery of the American housewife was not a collection of isolated personal tragedies, but the inevitable outcome of a system that defined women exclusively by their relationships to others: wife, mother, daughter, helpmate, never self. This argument was radical for its time, not because it was new, but because it was presented in language that middle-class women could understand and accept. Friedan was not a radical. She was a suburban mother with a degree in psychology, a woman who wore dresses and went to PTA meetings and had initially believed, as much as anyone, in the dream she was now dismantling. She was credible precisely because she was not an outsider throwing stones. She was an insider who had discovered that the walls were made of glass. The letters that poured into Friedan's mailbox in the months and years after publication are among the most moving documents in American social history. They came from every state in the Union, from women of every background and circumstance. A farm wife in Kansas wrote that she had read the book by kerosene lamp after her children were asleep, and had stayed awake until dawn, too electrified to close her eyes. A wealthy matron from Connecticut wrote that she had been seeing a psychiatrist for 5 years without making progress, and that one weekend with Friedan's book had done more for her than 100 sessions on a couch. A young mother in Oregon wrote that she had been planning to leave her husband, not because he was cruel, but because she could not bear another year of the life they were living. And she had told no one because she could not explain why a good man and a good house and good children were not enough. The book gave her the explanation. But if you think this story is just about a book and the women it touched, you are missing the larger earthquake that was beginning to rumble beneath the surface of American life. The Feminine Mystique was not merely a bestseller. It was a detonator, and the explosion it set off would reshape the legal, social, and emotional landscape of the country in ways that are still being felt today. The first shockwave hit the medical establishment. The data on housewives and mental health, which had been sitting in academic journals and survey reports for years, suddenly acquired a new and uncomfortable context. Researchers who had documented the high rates of depression among suburban mothers without drawing any systemic conclusions began to face sharp new questions. Were tranquilizers being prescribed to treat a genuine medical condition or to silence a legitimate complaint? Was the housewife syndrome a problem of sick women or of a sick role? A handful of psychiatrists, including a few who had been prescribing Valium by the bottle, began to reconsider their approach. Some started referring patients to talk therapy instead of reaching for the prescription pad. Others began asking questions about their patients' lives that went beyond symptom checklists. The shift was small, partial, and fiercely resisted by the pharmaceutical industry, but it was real. The second shockwave hit the media. Women's magazines, which had spent 15 years publishing articles about the joys of waxing floors and the art of being the perfect wife, suddenly found themselves out of step with a growing segment of their readership. The editor of one major women's magazine, whose name was not revealed to the public, caused a scandal within the industry when she confided to a journalist that the letters from miserable housewives were so numerous that she had created a separate file drawer for them, which she privately called the Drawer of Despair. The magazines that had done so much to construct and enforce the feminine mystique now scrambled to pivot. Articles about career opportunities and education for women began appearing alongside the recipes and fashion spreads. McCall's ran a piece titled "The Revolt of the American Woman," which, while carefully couched in reassurances about the continuing value of marriage and motherhood, acknowledged for the first time that something was seriously wrong. Good Housekeeping, that bastion of domestic virtue, published a series on women returning to college. The changes were tentative, hedged, and often contradictory, but they represented a fissure in the monolith. The third shockwave was the one that nobody saw coming, or at least nobody admitted to seeing. It hit the institution of marriage itself. Friedan had not set out to attack marriage. She was married herself, and she believed that equality between the sexes could be achieved within the framework of family life. But the logic of her argument led inexorably toward a question that could not be contained. If the traditional housewife role was a trap, what was the alternative? For many women, the answer that emerged over the following years was to restructure their marriages or to leave them. The divorce rate in the United States had been relatively stable throughout the 1950s, but in the mid-1960s, it began to creep upward, slowly at first, and then with gathering momentum. By 1969, the year that historians would later identify as the inflection point, the divorce rate was climbing at a pace that alarmed social conservatives and even some liberals who had not anticipated this particular consequence of women's awakening. The numbers tell a stark story. In 1960, the crude divorce rate in the United States was around 2.2 per 1,000 people. By 1980, that figure had spiked to 5.2 per 1,000, a 136% increase. Behind those numbers were individual decisions, made in kitchens and bedrooms and lawyers' offices, by women who had decided that the unhappiness they had been told to accept was no longer acceptable. The historian Stephanie Coontz would later put it with characteristic bluntness: feminism did not make good marriages go bad. Feminist reforms gave women the opportunity to get out of unhappy or unfair marriages. And many, many women seized that opportunity. But the divorce statistics, dramatic as they were, told only part of the story. The larger story was about a generational transfer of awareness. The women who read Friedan's book in 1963 and 1964, who wept over it and argued about it and passed it to their friends, were not the only ones watching. Their daughters were watching too. The girls who grew up in the 1950s and early 1960s had observed, with the acute perception of children, the quiet suffering of their mothers. They had seen the afternoon drinking, the unexplained headaches, the tears behind closed doors, the pills in the medicine cabinet. They had heard the arguments their parents thought they could not hear. They had felt, even if they could not articulate it, the low-grade hum of unhappiness that ran through so many of the homes on their streets. And as they came of age in the late 1960s and early 1970s, they were determined not to repeat the pattern. These daughters became the foot soldiers of second-wave feminism. They were the ones who filled the consciousness-raising groups, joined the National Organization for Women, marched in the streets, demanded equal pay and reproductive rights, and an end to employment discrimination. Unlike their mothers, who had mostly suffered in isolation, these young women discovered that collective action could be a solvent for shame. The format of the consciousness-raising group, which spread from city to city with astonishing speed in the late 1960s, was deceptively simple. A small group of women would gather in someone's living room. They would take turns speaking about their experiences, their childhoods, their relationships, their frustrations, their fears. There were no experts, no leaders, no therapeutic framework. The only rule was that each woman spoke for herself, and that the others listened without judgment. What emerged from these sessions was a collective recognition that the personal was political. The struggles that each woman had believed were uniquely her own were in fact shared by nearly everyone in the room. The isolation that had been one of the most devastating features of the housewife's experience was shattered. Meanwhile, the legal infrastructure of gender inequality was being dismantled piece by piece. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, which had included a prohibition on sex discrimination in employment largely as a result of strategic maneuvering by a small group of women in Congress, became an unexpectedly powerful tool. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, initially reluctant to take sex discrimination seriously, was forced by a barrage of complaints and protests to change its stance. Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972 opened the floodgates for women in higher education and athletics. The Supreme Court's decision in Roe v. Wade in 1973 transformed the landscape of reproductive rights. Each of these developments had its own complex history, its own cast of advocates and opponents, its own specific battles. But they all drew energy from the same deep spring, the awakening that Friedan's book had crystallized, and the determination of a new generation to live differently from their mothers. And yet, even as the movement gained momentum, the costs were mounting. For every woman who marched out of her suburban kitchen and into a new life, there was another who could not make the leap. Some were too old, too financially dependent, too terrified of the unknown. Some had internalized the feminine mystique so deeply that they could not imagine an alternative, even when it was presented to them in the clearest possible terms. Others tried to change and found themselves caught between two worlds, too liberated for their old lives but too shaped by their upbringing to feel comfortable in the new one. The transition was brutal for many and fatal for some. The divorce rate that was a statistic of liberation for some women was a statistic of abandonment and poverty for others. The feminist slogan "Sisterhood is powerful" was inspiring, but it could not pay the rent or quiet the fear of a woman who had never been taught to support herself. The pharmaceutical industry, for its part, did not retreat quietly. As the women's movement gained steam, the marketing of tranquilizers shifted to match the new anxieties. Valium was still prescribed in massive quantities, but the advertisements began to feature not just housewives, but also working women, now depicted as stressed and overwhelmed by the demands of their new double shifts. The solution, the ads insisted, was still the same little yellow pill. The industry had found a new market niche, and it exploited it with the same ruthless efficiency it had applied to the housewife market a decade earlier. The underlying message remained remarkably consistent. Women's distress was a medical problem requiring a chemical solution. The social context was irrelevant. And then there were the women whose suffering had been so profound that no movement, no book, no new law could reach them in time. In the years following Sylvia Plath's death, her poetry and her life story became a kind of dark mirror in which the women's movement could see its own origins and its own limitations. Plath's posthumous collection, Ariel, was published in 1965, and it landed like a blow. The poems were not political in any obvious sense, but they were ferocious in their honesty about the experience of being a brilliant, ambitious woman trapped in a domestic cage. Lines like, "Dying is an art, like everything else, I do it exceptionally well," became touchstones for a generation of women who recognized in Plath's voice something they had felt but never been able to express. Her suicide became, in the retelling, a cautionary tale about what happened when a woman's gifts were denied an outlet. But it was also something more complicated. A reminder that even the most powerful art could not always save the artist. The tragedy of Plath was not that she was unhappy. It was that she saw the truth of her situation with such clarity and still could not escape it. The convergence of all these forces, the book, the movement, the legal battles, the pharmaceutical pushback, the generational transfer of trauma and resolve, the ghosts of those who did not make it out, set the stage for the most explosive period of social change in American history since the Civil War. By the mid-1970s, the landscape of gender relations in the United States had been altered beyond recognition. The changes were not complete, and they were fiercely contested at every step. But the direction was unmistakable. The feminine mystique, as an unquestioned orthodoxy, was dead. The problem that had no name had been named, analyzed, protested, legislated against, and in many ways overcome. But the story does not end there, because if you think the daughters of the 1950s housewives simply walked out of their mothers' kitchens and into a better world, you are only seeing half the picture. The other half is about the mothers who stayed behind, who never made it out, whose stories are only now being told. And it is about the granddaughters who are still untangling the legacy of what happened in those quiet houses with the manicured lawns, still trying to understand why their grandmothers wept in bathrooms and their mothers were so angry, and the ghost of something unspeakable seemed to hang in the air at every family gathering. The personal is political, the feminists said, but the political is also hereditary. And the inheritance of the feminine mystique is a debt that is still being paid. The inheritance was paid first by the mothers who never left. For every woman who read the feminine mystique and felt the ground shift beneath her feet, there were many more who read it and felt only terror, or who never read it at all, who passed their days in the same routines they had learned as young brides and could not imagine any other way to live. The feminine mystique was not a door they could open and walk through. It was the air they breathed, and you cannot revolt against the air. These women aged into their 50s and 60s and 70s, with the accumulated weight of decades of unexpressed grief. Some of them became the grandmothers who seemed perpetually sad, who sat at family gatherings with a distant look, who rarely spoke about their own lives because they had been trained from girlhood to believe that their lives were not interesting. Others became brittle and bitter, their unhappiness curdling into resentment that lashed out at daughters who seemed to have choices they never had. The tension between the silent generation of mothers and the roaring generation of daughters became one of the defining emotional dynamics of the late 20th century. Family therapy offices filled with women in their 20s and 30s trying to understand why their mothers seemed so angry, so withholding, so disappointed. And on the other side of the conversation, the mothers, unable or unwilling to explain that they had poured their entire selves into a role that society had told them was sacred, only to watch their daughters reject it as a trap. Some of the mothers did try to change late and with great difficulty. In the 1970s, community colleges and state universities saw a surge of older women enrolling for the first time. They were nervous and often apologized for taking up space. They sat in the front rows, took meticulous notes, and spoke about their education with a hushed reverence that their teenaged classmates found baffling. For these women, the classroom was not a stepping stone to a career, though many of them did eventually enter the workforce. It was a belated taste of something they had been denied: the life of the mind, the permission to take their own thoughts seriously. One of them, a 52-year-old mother of 4 from Ohio, told a reporter in 1974 that going to college felt like waking up from a long sleep. "For 30 years," she said, "I only read cookbooks. Now I read everything." But for every woman who found a late renaissance, there was another who simply could not. Some lacked the money, or the transportation, or the fragile confidence required to walk into a classroom. Others were married to men who forbade it, and they had no legal or financial resources to defy those husbands. Still others were so profoundly depressed that they could barely get through a day, let alone contemplate a new life. These women continued to rely on the chemical supports that had been prescribed to them in their younger years. As Valium prescriptions eventually declined under the weight of addiction concerns and regulatory pressure, other drugs took their place. By the 1980s, a new generation of antidepressants, led by Prozac, was being marketed with the same promise that had sold Miltown and Valium decades before: relief from the unbearable heaviness of daily existence. The daughters, meanwhile, were learning that liberation had its own burdens. The women who entered the workforce in the 1970s and 80s did not find the promised land their mothers had been denied. They found workplaces that were often hostile, bosses who expected sexual favors, paychecks that were a fraction of what men earned for the same work, and a society that was still deeply ambivalent about whether women should be there at all. And on top of the professional struggle, they found that the domestic expectations had not disappeared. The housework did not go away when the wife went to work. It simply got squeezed into the margins, completed late at night and early in the morning, or outsourced to poorer women who had even fewer choices. The double shift, as sociologist Arlie Hochschild would later call it, became the defining condition of the working woman's life. She was expected to compete like a man at the office and nurture like a mother at home, and to do both with a smile. The emotional toll was significant. By the 1990s, surveys were showing that while women had made enormous gains in education, employment, and legal rights, they were not, on average, happier than their mother's generation had been. Some studies suggested they were less happy. The optimism of the early feminist movement, the sense that dismantling the feminine mystique would naturally lead to fulfillment, had run aground on the complexity of actual lives. Women had won the right to work. They had not won the right to a society that supported them in doing so. Child care was expensive and hard to find. Parental leave was minimal. The work culture was built around the assumption of a full-time homemaker, even after the homemaker had become a rarity. And the cultural messaging, while no longer insisting that women belonged only in the kitchen, had simply split into a new set of contradictory demands. Be ambitious but not aggressive. Be maternal but not smothering. Be attractive but not distracting. Be successful but not threatening. The pharmaceutical industry adapted to this new reality with its usual agility. The advertising for antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications in the 1990s and 2000s featured harried working mothers, as prominently as the Valium ads of the 1960s had featured serene housewives. The bottle of pills was no longer just mother's little helper. It was the working woman's survival kit, and the prescriptions kept flowing. By the early 21st century, women in the United States were still being prescribed antidepressants at roughly twice the rate of men. Some things had changed. The underlying pattern had not. But the most surprising chapter of this story concerns the granddaughters. The women who came of age in the 2000s and 2010s, the third generation after the feminine mystique, grew up in a world that their grandmothers could not have imagined. They were told from infancy that they could be anything. They outperformed boys in school, enrolled in college in higher numbers, and entered professions that had been closed to women just a generation earlier. They had access to contraception and reproductive health care that would have seemed like science fiction to the women of the 1950s. And yet, when researchers began to study their inner lives, they found something unexpected. These young women were reporting rates of anxiety, depression, and burnout that rivaled or exceeded those of their grandmother's generation. The problem that had no name had not disappeared. It had mutated. Part of this was the sheer relentless pressure of modern life, which affects all genders. But part of it was specific to the experience of being a woman in a culture that had inherited the residues of the feminine mystique without fully examining them. The expectation that women should be effortlessly perfect, which in the 1950s had applied mainly to domestic performance, had expanded to encompass every domain. The young women of the 21st century were expected to excel at school, build impressive careers, maintain beautiful homes, cultivate fit bodies, be emotionally available partners, devoted mothers, attentive friends, and do it all while projecting an image of serene competence on social media. The platform had changed, but the impossible standard was hauntingly familiar. Social media, in particular, had become a new delivery system for a very old poison. the curated perfection of Instagram and TikTok, the endless scroll of other people's apparently flawless lives, functioned in much the same way that the women's magazines of the 1950s had functioned. They presented an idealized version of womanhood that was impossible to achieve, and they made women feel like failures for falling short. The difference was that the 1950s housewife could close the magazine. The 21st century woman carried the feed in her pocket, available at all hours, ready to serve up a fresh dose of inadequacy whenever she had a moment of quiet. The consequences showed up in emergency rooms and therapists' offices, in the soaring rates of self-harm among adolescent girls, in the exhausted confessions of mothers who felt they were failing at everything even as they were objectively succeeding. The lineage from the afternoon cocktail ritual of the 1950s to the wine mom culture of the 2010s was not hard to trace. The jokes about needing a drink after dealing with the children, the memes about rosé as a survival mechanism, the normalization of alcohol as the coping strategy of choice for overwhelmed mothers, all of these were echoes of a much older story. The packaging had been updated, but the substance was the same, a chemical buffer between the self and a life that did not fit. And yet, the granddaughters had something that the grandmothers did not. They had the story. They knew, even if only dimly, that the pressure they felt had a history. They knew that their grandmothers had been told that a clean floor was the measure of a woman's worth, and they knew that this was a lie. They knew that their mothers had fought battles for equality and had won many of them, even if the victory was incomplete. The feminist awakening of the 1960s and 70s had not solved every problem, but it had given subsequent generations a vocabulary and a framework. It had made it possible to say out loud in public that the demands placed on women were unreasonable. The suffering was still there, but the silence was broken. The breaking of the silence had other consequences too, ones that are still unfolding. In the early decades of the 21st century, a wave of family memoirs began appearing, written by the daughters and granddaughters of the 1950s housewives, exploring the unspoken grief they had witnessed in their childhood homes. Books with titles like The Liars Club and The Glass Castle and Educated did not always center on the feminine mystique explicitly, but they shared a common thread: the excavation of family secrets, the naming of what had been hidden, the refusal to carry the silence forward. These books were not just personal documents. They were acts of historical recovery, filling in the blank spaces that the official record had left empty. And then there were the late-life confessions. In nursing homes and hospice beds, as the generation of the 1950s housewives approached the end of their lives, some of them began to speak. Daughters who had spent decades wondering why their mothers were so distant, so sad, so angry, finally received answers. The stories that emerged were not always tidy. They included accounts of illegal abortions, hidden affairs, secret ambitions, closeted identities, and quiet breakdowns that had been managed without anyone ever knowing. The historian who sifts through these accounts will find a portrait of a generation that was systematically lied to about the nature of its own lives, and that then had to spend decades constructing the truth from fragments. One of those fragments, returning now to the woman who opened this story, is particularly telling. Eleanor, the 27-year-old mother from Levittown, who wrote in her diary that she had everything she ever wanted and wondered why it felt like nothing, did not become a feminist. She did not read The Feminine Mystique, or if she did, she never mentioned it to anyone. She continued to live in the same house, on the same street, for another 40 years. She raised her children, attended their graduations and weddings, and cared for her husband through a long illness before his death. To her neighbors, she was a quiet, reliable presence, a woman who kept a neat house and a tidy garden and rarely complained about anything. But her daughter, a woman named Catherine, who was born in 1952, remembers something else. She remembers her mother standing at the kitchen sink, motionless, staring out the window at a view she had seen 10,000 times, her hands still in the soapy water, her face absolutely blank. Catherine would call her name, and it would take a moment for Eleanor to return, to put the smile back on, to resume the endless work of keeping the house running. When Catherine asked her, years later, what she had been thinking about in those moments, Eleanor said only, "Nothing, dear. I was just resting my eyes." But Catherine found the diary after her mother died. It was in a shoebox in the back of the closet, along with some old photographs and a dried corsage from a high school dance. The entries were sporadic, covering a period from the early 1950s to the mid-60s, after which they stopped entirely. The early entries were full of nervous excitement about marriage and the new house and the babies. The later entries were shorter, flatter, the handwriting more cramped, as if the writer was running out of space. The final entry was dated October 12, 1966. It read, in its entirety, "It is raining again. The boys have gone to school. I cleaned the oven this morning, and now I am sitting at the table. There is nothing wrong. There is nothing wrong." Catherine read it 3 times, and then she sat on the floor of her mother's empty house and wept not for her mother's death, but for her mother's life. Eleanor's story is not exceptional. It is the rule. Millions of American women lived and died inside the same silence, never finding the language to name what they felt, never receiving the permission to demand more. They are the quiet majority of the 20th century, the anonymous casualties of a system that was so comprehensive, so taken for granted, that it was almost invisible to the people living inside it. The feminist movement of the 1960s and 70s is rightly celebrated for what it achieved, but the movement arrived too late for Eleanor and for countless others like her. They had already internalized the lessons of the feminine mystique so completely that they could not unlearn them, even when a book came along that explained their suffering with perfect clarity. And yet, the silence was not absolute. For all the stories of women who never made it out, there are also stories of women who did. Not the famous ones, the Friedens and the Steinhams and the Abzugs, but ordinary women who, in small and unheralded ways, refused to accept the life they had been assigned. The mother who took a part-time job at the library against her husband's wishes and discovered a world of ideas she had been denied. The housewife who started painting at the age of 40 and 10 years later had become a working artist. The grandmother who, after her children left home, enrolled in community college and earned the degree she had been told she did not need. These stories did not make headlines, but they accumulated one by one into a quiet counter-narrative of resistance and survival. The historian who wants to trace the fate of the feminine mystique must look not only at the dramatic events of the 1960s and 70s, the marches and the court cases and the books, but also at the slow subterranean shifts that continued for decades afterward. The change was not linear. It was bumpy, contested, and full of setbacks. The Equal Rights Amendment, which seemed like an inevitability in the early 1970s, was never ratified. The backlash of the 1980s, with its celebration of wealth and its suspicion of feminist demands, pushed the movement onto the defensive. The culture wars of the 1990s and 2000s kept gender at the center of political conflict, with reproductive rights under constant assault and the vocabulary of feminism itself becoming a contested battleground. The feminine mystique, in its original form, was dead, but the assumptions that had given rise to it proved remarkably durable. The durability of those assumptions can be measured in the statistics that continue to accumulate year after year. American women still do significantly more housework and childcare than American men, even when both partners work full-time. Mothers still face career penalties that fathers do not, a phenomenon that economists call the motherhood penalty. Women still earn on average about 82 cents for every dollar earned by men, a gap that has barely budged in the last 2 decades. The United States remains one of the few developed countries without guaranteed paid parental leave. The infrastructure that would genuinely support women's full participation in public life, affordable childcare, flexible work arrangements, A culture that values caregiving as real work remains stubbornly incomplete. The feminist revolution, as one historian put it, is unfinished. And for many women, it feels not unfinished but stalled. But to focus only on what has not changed is to miss the magnitude of what has. In 1955, a woman could not open a bank account without her husband's permission. She could not serve on a jury in many states. She could be legally fired for becoming pregnant. She could be denied admission to most universities and most professions, not because she lacked qualifications, but because she was female. The world that Eleanor inhabited was not just psychologically constricted. It was legally, economically, and institutionally constricted in ways that are almost difficult for a modern mind to fully grasp. The fact that these restrictions now seem archaic, that the idea of a woman being legally barred from a profession seems like something from a historical novel rather than living memory, is a measure of how far the current has moved. The question that remains, hanging over the story like an unanswered letter, is what it all meant. The suffering of the 1950s housewives was real, documented, and vast. The movement that arose in response to that suffering was heroic, imperfect, and transformative. The legacy that movement left behind is contradictory, partial, and still unfolding. And at the center of it all, there are the individual women who lived through it, who made choices and compromises and sacrifices, who suffered and endured and occasionally triumphed, and whose stories are only now being told in full. They are not footnotes to the larger narrative. They are the narrative. Eleanor and Sylvia and Betty and all the others whose names we will never know. They lived inside a dream that was also a trap. And when the dream broke, as it had to break, they were the ones who had to pick up the pieces and figure out what to build from the wreckage. The inheritance of the feminine mystique is a debt that is still being paid. But it is also a gift, an awareness passed down from grandmother to mother to daughter, that the pictures in the magazines are not real, that the smiling faces in the advertisements are hiding something, and that the question, "Is this all there is?" deserves an answer. The answer, as it turned out, was no. What does it mean to inherit a silence? This is not a rhetorical question. It is a practical one, and it is being answered right now, in kitchens and bedrooms and therapy offices and late-night conversations between women who are trying to understand why they feel the way they feel, why their mothers were the way they were, why a certain kind of sadness seems to run through their family line like a watermark on old paper. The feminine mystique, for all its mid-century specificity, is not merely a historical artifact. It is a living legacy, and the people who carry it may not even know its name. Consider the grandmother who never speaks about her own ambitions because she was trained to believe she had none. Consider the mother who fought her way into a career and then felt guilty every day she left her children with a sitter. Consider the daughter who has been told she can be anything and now lies awake at 3 in the morning, wondering why being everything is so exhausting. These three women are not separate stories. They are one story, unfolding across generations, each chapter reacting to the one before it without fully understanding what came before. The grandmother's silence becomes the mother's anger, becomes the daughter's burnout. And none of it makes sense unless you know the history. The history, as we have seen, is not ancient. It is within living memory. There are women alive today who were told, as young mothers in the 1950s and 60s, that their unhappiness was a personal defect. There are women alive today who remember the afternoon cocktails and the mother's little helpers and the doctor who told them to stop making a fuss. There are women alive today who read the feminine mystique when it was new and felt, for the first time, that someone had spoken the truth of their lives. They are old now, these women, and many of them still have things they have never said out loud. When they die, their stories will die with them, unless someone asks, unless someone listens, unless someone writes it down. The temptation, when confronting a story like this, is to look for clear heroes and villains, for a clean arc of oppression and liberation. But the reality is messier. The men of the 1950s were not monsters. They were products of the same cultural machinery as their wives, trained to believe that providing a paycheck was the full measure of their duty, and emotionally starved in ways they had no vocabulary to describe. The advertisers who sold the feminine mystique were not cartoon villains. They were people doing a job, unaware of the wreckage their work was causing. Even the doctors who overprescribed tranquilizers were, in most cases, genuinely trying to help. They were simply trapped inside a frame that made it impossible to see the real problem. The history of the feminine mystique is not a history of evil people doing evil things. It is a history of ordinary people living inside a set of assumptions that were wrong and causing enormous harm without ever intending to. This is, in many ways, the most uncomfortable kind of history to confront. It is easier to condemn monsters than to recognize that good people can be complicit in a bad system. It is easier to celebrate liberation than to acknowledge that liberation is always incomplete. It is easier to draw a line between then and now, and say that things are different than to admit that the residues of the old assumptions are still working in the culture, still shaping the choices that seem freely made, still whispering the old lies in new language. But the story of the 1950s housewife is not, in the end, a story about despair. It is a story about the power of naming. The problem that had no name became a problem with a name, and once it had a name, it could be fought. The women who fought it did not win every battle. They did not finish the revolution, but they changed the world enough that their daughters and granddaughters could stand on the ground they cleared and see further. The feminine mystique, as an unquestioned orthodoxy, is dead, and it was killed not by bombs or decrees but by words, by a book, by conversations, by the slow, stubborn accumulation of truths that had been suppressed. If you take nothing else from this story, take this. The things we do not talk about have power over us. The silences we keep become the prisons we inhabit, and the act of speaking, of writing, of testifying is never only personal. It is always political, whether we intend it to be or not. The women who wrote to Betty Friedan were not trying to start a revolution. They were just trying to understand their own lives. But their letters, multiplied by millions, became a force that reshaped the world. Eleanor's diary, hidden in a shoebox for 40 years, was not a political document, but when Catherine read it after her mother's death, it changed her understanding of everything, and it changed, in some small but real way, the historical record. Every story matters. Every silence broken matters, because the silence we inherit does not have to be the silence we leave behind. If this story resonated with you, if it stirred something you cannot quite name, there is a reason for that. The history we have traced tonight is not finished. It is still being written in the choices you make, in the conversations you have, in the questions you ask the people who came before you. Subscribe to the channel, and we will continue to explore the stories that history forgot, the voices that were silenced, and the truths that are only now being uncovered. For now, let the quiet of the night settle around you. Let your mind rest. And if you happen to dream of a woman standing at a kitchen sink, staring out the window, her hands still in the soapy water, you will know something about her that she may not have known herself. You will know that she was not alone,